Hello, it is Jonathan with Heroes Gate 3D. Thank you for watching my videos. I haven't made a video in a while because my GoPro 11 Black stopped working. The last video I made, I was talking about, what was it? The screen protector video. The camera kept getting really hot and turning off. I contacted GoPro and let them know, and they had me do different tests on it and asked me questions about if I got it wet and stuff like that, what SD card I was using, and it was out of warranty by, my warranty ended in July, I think they said. So I thought, I'm just going to be stuck with a broken camera. And the guy said, the gentleman I was talking to said, give me a few minutes, let me talk to my supervisor. And he came back in about 10 minutes and he said, good news, we're going to replace your camera. So I was excited, and they replaced it for free, even though I was out of warranty, because it had been getting hot and shutting down. And so I was very excited about that. I just got my camera back, and so I'm going to start filming again when I paint. Thank you for watching my videos. I really like GoPro. I had the GoPro Hero Black 9, and then I bought the 11, and I really like the video quality, so I'll be sticking with them. Thank you all for watching my videos. If you like this, please like, share, and subscribe. Right now I'm painting a, I've been painting off video a little bit, just because I didn't have a camera. I used my phone to do the, what is it? The reviews for the Eldoo Saturn 4. But I'm painting this guy right now. He's a Shipwreck Golem. Here's his arm. I've done the wood, and I'm going to do the rest of him on camera. I didn't really know how long it was going to take. It took a week because I sent the camera in last week. There's his other arm. This is from Archvillian Games. I was painting the Vampire King on the Lich Throne. Here's his hand. But I finished it. There you go. I just have to put him together. Here's the Lich King I finished. I did him all off of camera because I didn't have one. I still have to paint this part back here, but other than that, he's done. Here's the sword. Switch hands. I like the way he turned out. This part here is filler. I have to trace the blue over it. It's not green stuff, but it's like that. The epoxy sculpt. After I glue him to the base, then I'll show the rest of him. Okay, we'll get to painting. Right now I am painting the white portions, like anything that I accidentally painted over, just painting all that white. So I've already did the rust effects, and I've already done the wood, and I've painted some of the metal. I need to do highlights, but painted all that. These are the legs for him. I need to do highlights on the chains, and so I still have a lot to do. The Shipwreck Golem, I think I said that, is from Archvillian Games, and I printed out a what is it? A hyena god, I believe, but he's from Archvillian Games too. Okay, let me move the camera. Stop this. I thought I pressed record. Oh, he's forgetting to press record. When I got the camera on my face, it's easier to notice that it's not recording, but when I'm paying attention to painting, it's easy to not notice it.
proximity to so much concentrated ambient mana increased a core's growth, even without the visitations by the nearby humans, and speed of crystallization by tenfold or more. In fact, only a few years before, Whistler Senedre had been a low E-rated dungeon, which just went to show how beneficial being nearby could be. Once she reached A first rating, of course, she would be forced to move. Another juvenile core that showed great promise would then be rotated into her place. Even the territorial areas just a little farther away from the convergence were coveted, as their growth was sped up greatly, but not nearly as much as the closest spot. Then again, with Wisley's territory going even deeper into the historically no-cores land of the convergence, the amount of ambient mana would increase even more. But she was going to be using most of that, along with what mana the dozens of nearby cores were feeding her, to ensure the assault on the territory was successful. As Eyre watched the dungeon defenders that Wisley had created line up along the border, she couldn't help but hope that something unexpected happened. While she could play out what was likely going to happen in her mind, she nevertheless held to the belief that this cursed born was different, that it was the answer to all of their eventual problems. The Supreme of Eyre was looking forward to seeing if her instincts in this situation were correct, or if she was searching for a solution in the wrong place. Chapter 9. Fred had been ushered out from the council chamber soon after he had announced that the border of his territory was now effectively surrounded by monsters. He was about to instinctively call them dungeon defenders, but at the last moment he remembered that they were referred to as something else entirely by humans. And monsters did sound more menacing, which was exactly the way they were acting. As soon as he and his friends were outside the small council building above ground, they could hear the bong-bong of alarm bells going off near the walls. He hadn't really heard them before when the first army of dark, earth, and nature monsters had arrived, mainly because he was underground dealing with an inquisitor bent on recapturing him. People all around were streaming through the government quarter, heading for the walls, though even more were stationed around the prison and council building. They had obviously learned from the initial attack that they really didn't have a good defense against flying monsters at the wall, and they knew, or at least thought they knew, where they would likely attack. There were many more guards there than had been present before, and a quick look at his territorial site around the city of All Roads showed that many of those on the walls were now closer by. While there were still quite a few on the walls, most of the defense appeared to be taken over by members from the DAS instead. Fred, what's going on? All you said was that your territory border is now completely surrounded on all sides. Issa asked him, just loud enough to be heard over the loud bells in the distance. Let's get back inside the prison building and I'll tell you. I didn't get a chance to explain exactly what's happening before they rushed us out, and I need to tell the Inquisitor as well, he replied. Issa didn't look happy about that for some reason, but she didn't actually say anything. It wasn't long before the bells were just barely audible to them as they walked inside the prison, and even then they were muffled when Fred and the others were escorted into a relatively small room with a round wooden table and a half-dozen chairs. Sit down for now until we can figure out what's going on, Charisse said roughly. If it looks like it's going to come to fighting here, your instructions, Fred, are to head back down to your dungeon while we protect you from above. Your shard friends, however, are welcome to help with the defense. The fact that they were willing to protect him with their lives made Fred confused, especially when they were just contemplating whether or not to kill or exile him not so long ago. Going back to his interrupted conversation with the All Roads Council, however, made him think that his personal safety wasn't necessarily a concern. It was quite possible that they were thinking of him as an asset that could provide something they didn't have access to before. But he wasn't exactly sure what they wanted. When he first thought about making some sort of deal with them, to both save his own life and the lives of his friends, he was thinking of helping to provide a dungeon where they could train without the risk of death, where they could obtain essence to improve themselves. He also thought about the opportunity to teach any of his adapted abilities to them, though they hadn't seemed as impressed by that as he had expected. Probably because the chance of them learning anything really worth their time was hampered by my own lack of a higher adventurer rating. No, what really seemed to interest them was Issa and Ragnar's statuses as shards. But for the life of him, he didn't know what they could possibly want. He refused to go out and destroy more dungeon cores to obtain more pieces that could be used to make shards. And if they started to do that, he would refuse to help. He wasn't there in all roads to assemble some sort of human army that was focused on destroying all of the dungeon cores around the world. He was there to find some way they could coexist without one being more powerful than the others. Where the humans, or even the cores, though that wasn't really a current possibility, as a species weren't at risk of being extremely endangered, and possibly enslaved, or go extinct altogether. He wasn't sure how to go about that, but he knew the first thing he needed to do was put them all on equal footing, which was his goal with the teaching and providing essence via his dungeon, as it would make them stronger and able to become self-sufficient without the need to brave the dangers of delving through other dungeons. From there, his hope was to dictate some sort of treaty with the surrounding dungeon cores, the details of which were still a little fuzzy in his head, where the consequences for killing a human were seen as just as bad as killing a dungeon core. There was a lot more to it than that, but the first step was trying to eliminate so many people dying inside and outside of dungeons because of the core's actions. Only then could the human species hope to recover from the rapid decline it was currently experiencing. But the council seemed to have another objective in mind. Before he could think any more on that, he needed to put Charissa's mind at ease. Somewhat. "You don't have to worry about us being attacked, quite yet," he told her while he was sitting down in one of the surprisingly comfortable chairs, which confused everyone in the room. "What do you mean? What do you know that you aren't telling us?" Agglestein, the necro-wizard that had been accompanying the Inquisitor everywhere she went, asked, suspicious. Fred took a moment to think about what he was going to share, because, for the most part, it was going to be common knowledge soon. "Well, I have some good news and I have some bad news. The good news is that while my entire territory border is completely blocked off by monsters, they are currently moving. There is a large contingent of them inside my territory, but there's also a good number of them inside the other territories butting up against it. That sounds worrisome, all right, but that is definitely good news. There are many on the wall that are still recovering their power from the first fight, myself and Agglestein included, and this isn't the ideal time to be attacked. Not that any time is ideal. I'm afraid to ask what the bad news is, then," the Inquisitor remarked, her tone evidently worried. Fred sighed, knowing they would find out soon enough regardless, but this way they might have a better idea what they were going up against. Two bad things, actually. One, the monsters that are surrounding the border, well, some of them are familiar from the previous attack, are a lot stronger than before. "What do you mean stronger? And how do you know?" "That's right, I forgot you don't know. I can see their levels, which are kind of like our ratings when I look at them. Just like I can see your interface," he said before being cut off. "Wait a minute! You can see our interfaces?" Agglestein asked, incredulous. "Yes, but that's beside the point. Did you notice how relatively weak all of those monsters from the first attack were? Most of those that invaded all roads were what is considered level 1, with a few level 2s mixed in. This put them at the weakest state that they could possibly be. Though the difference between a level 1 goblin gnome and a level 1 hell-touched bear demon is quite considerable. I believe the previous assault on this city was thrown together rather quickly, and was more of a reaction to my presence here, and it was designed to overwhelm the defenses with numbers to get enough through to kill me. I don't believe it was consciously intended to destroy the city and kill everyone, just to get to me," he answered slowly, working it out in his head while he spoke. "Okay, I guess that does make sense. Based on reports, and the lack of actual casualties other than outside the city, the monsters, while numerous, were not that powerful. Go on," the Inquisitor ordered, politely this time. "So anyway, while those were primarily level 1s that attacked, the monsters at the border range anywhere from level 7 to level 11. I know from my own experimentation that once you get past level 10, there are some diminishing returns on how much mana you spend on a creation, so that's why there aren't any at a higher level. Added to that, along with what you saw before, it appears as though some of the larger boss monsters, which I'm sure you're all quite well aware of, are there as well. While those larger monsters that you're probably used to seeing are deadly inside a dungeon, they are usually at a lower level. Not so these, which, with the increase in level, are quite a bit bigger than you've likely seen before. That could be a reason they aren't progressing further inside my territory and attacking the walls, because I'm almost positive that they don't want to risk harming the elemental concentrations along the valley. You've said that before, but I don't get it. Historically, there's a mandate to leave all of them alone out there, which has been passed down to this day as an irrefutable law. But no one knows exactly why, Agelstein asked curiously. Issa and Ragnark, as well as DC of course, could see the mana that dungeon cores used for nearly everything. But the two representatives from the All Roads government in the audience couldn't. Fred had to see if he could try to come up with a recognizable example that would make sense. Just like you rely on essence gained from dungeons to make yourself stronger, dungeon cores use something called mana to do the same thing. Though, unlike essence, if a core runs out of mana, they essentially die. It's what they're made of. It's a part of their life force, and they're practically insatiable when it comes to gaining more of it. When humans enter their dungeon, they give off mana that they can absorb, and can gain quite a bit more when someone dies within their deadly rooms. But they also acquire ambient mana that emanates from the world itself. Though there are areas like these convergences that the concentration is multiplied so greatly that it's practically inconceivable. Fred tried to give some background info to them, at least as far as he could. Then why are there no dungeons right here? Fred went on to explain how it used to be that way. But then there were conflicts at another convergence that ended up with its destruction, which affected and practically killed off the landscape for thousands of miles around the area. Agelstein scoffed. That seems stupid. Why would they endanger a place like that, knowing that it could kill off the surrounding lands if it were destroyed? Because, like I said, they're near insatiable when it comes to acquiring more mana. Look at it this way. Imagine if there was a fountain in the middle of All Roads that shot up a never-ending stream of essence. Now, the closer you were to it, the more essence you would absorb. And it affected the entire city. But those on the outskirts would get less. Now, if someone were to stand right on top of it, that stream would stop. And only the one standing on top of the fountain would benefit. How long do you think it would take for there to be an all-out war between everyone with an SDIA and for the city to be destroyed? Charisse looked thoughtful, but Agelstein answered right away. Probably within an hour, based on how crazy some members of the DAS can be when it comes to acquiring more essence. I can see what you're getting at, but why is this important? It's important because the Supreme Council of Dungeon Cores, like your own All Roads Council but made up of the most powerful cores in the world, actually came up with a way to prevent anyone from getting too close to the convergence, so that they wouldn't have to worry about it being destroyed. And why that is important, unfortunately, is that the cores closest to the convergence extended their territories farther into the valley, which gives them much more ambient mana to absorb, that in turn allows them to create even more monsters to send against us. Charisse spoke up, coming to her own conclusions. And now that they've had a taste of that sweet essence, or mana, like you said, they're less likely to want to give it up. I have a feeling that we were likely screwed as soon as you alerted them to your presence here. Even if we or they had killed you, or even if we had exiled you, then it was quite possible that we may have had a war of epic proportions on our hands. Maybe not tomorrow or the next day, but I've seen things like that happen before. And that was with people that could just fling spells around, not send entire armies of monsters to defeat their enemies. The room was quiet while she was talking, and it stayed that way when she finished. Fred couldn't help but agree with her, and he was pretty sure everyone else felt the same way. But you said there were two pieces of bad news. The level of the monsters out there, as well as their composition, was only one, wasn't it? Unless you meant that as both? Agelstein asked, breaking the silence. Unfortunately, you're right. There is some other bad news. When I said that the monsters around my territory border are surrounding all of it, I really meant the entire thing. Whereas the dark, earth, and nature territories had bumped up to my own during that first attack, they hadn't been surrounding it completely. Though they did make their monsters do so once they were close enough to the city. Now, however, the entire thing is enclosed, and we're trapped with no way out, even if we wanted to escape somehow. It took Charisse only a moment to catch on to what he was saying. You can't be serious. I thought you only destroyed... she said, before trailing off as horror set in. Yes, that's exactly right. All of the factions, fire, water, light, and now air, are surrounding us, with their own monsters adding to the massive encircling army. It looks like they got over their differences enough to work together to take me, and likely the entire city, down. When it was just the 3 that I wronged, they might have been content with my death, though I tend to doubt that. With all of them against me, us, that can only mean one thing. They are going to wipe all roads off the map, so that nothing like this can happen again. Again, silence reigned in the room, so deep that it almost seemed as though everyone even forgot to breathe. Issa surprised him by touching him on the arm and asking softly and sadly, "Then what are they waiting for? It sounds as if they have more than enough power to destroy us, even while still avoiding damaging those elemental concentrations." Fred was looking at the border again as something caught his attention, so he answered automatically. "I don't know, actually. Their behavior confuses me," he said. But then he froze as he felt something he'd never experienced before. It was almost the feeling of someone pushing his chest with gentle, yet constant force. And then he felt it along his back, and then his side, and then everywhere all at once. When he looked at the border again, he could visibly see that it had moved, inward. He wouldn't have even noticed if he hadn't seen a few of the defenders out there shuffle just the barest bit forward. But now that he knew what he was looking for, he could tell that every part of his territory sphere had shrunk. Everywhere. Not just in a few places, but every single inch where there were dungeon defenders. Which was essentially all of it except a small section where 2 of the enemy faction territories butted up against each other. It felt like he was being forcibly compressed down. And when he tried to fight against it, nothing happened. We may have a problem. Somehow, someway those monsters are making my territory shrink," he said, now feeling slightly, but not painfully, thankfully, uncomfortable. DC, do you know something? Fred used his mana communication skill to speak directly to her. "Information incoming." "Huh? Wait, hold on," he said out loud, involuntarily in surprise, looking at the direwolf that seemed to enjoy torturing him with information downloads. The next thing he knew, his mind blacked out, and he woke up what he thought was moments later, with a whole lot more information at his fingertips, and dread in his heart at what it meant. Chapter 10. With a bit of a headache from the massive influx of information DC sent him, Fred cleared his mind enough to pull it all up again, just to make sure he fully comprehended how screwed they were. Congratulations on graduating to the next step in your existence as a dungeon core. Now that you are joining the wider realm of interfactional conflict, there are some things that you need to know in order to take part in the exciting world of territorial warfare. Territorial warfare. Territorial warfare is a process in which a dungeon core attempts to attack and shrink the territory of another, with the ultimate goal of acquiring new territory for their faction. This is accomplished by pushing at the neutral border between 2 territories, thereby collapsing the available space of the defending dungeon core. Once past the original neutral border, the one doing the pushing is designated as the attacker, while the other is naturally called the defender. This will become important later in this discussion. The way the border is pushed is through the use of dungeon defenders. Any defenders can be used in this process, as long as they are stationed right up against the border and have this specific order given to them. Expand. This will allow them to push the other border back, while at the same time expanding your territory forward. Note, while your territory expands forward, your overall territorial space does not change. So if you are already at your maximum spread, you will lose area in the exact opposite direction of your forward push. It is best to use the most powerful defenders you possess, however, as the defending core can use theirs to destroy your attackers, and therefore push back your expansion. This can mean that territorial warfare can last anywhere from days and weeks to decades or even centuries before there is a clear winner, especially with the back-and-forth nature of the conflict. Expansion and shrinkage can happen at different speeds, though it is fairly constant when attacking a faction other than your own. On the rare occasions where a rogue dungeon core needs to be removed due to instability or other reasons, internal faction territorial warfare is much more time-consuming. The expansion and shrinkage is approximately 30 times slower in that event. Only one dungeon core territory of a particular faction can attack another faction at the same time, though they can receive aid in the form of mana transfers. This does not apply to Alliance partners, however, meaning that both Alliance members, or all three if they are in the Nature, Earth, and Water factions, can attack the same territory at the same time. The restriction on a single dungeon core per faction participating in an attack does not apply to defenders. An unlimited number of nearby cores can send aid in the form of mana or dungeon defenders, though keep in mind that sharing those resources from their territories could mean that they are in turn more vulnerable to attack. In addition, defenders sent from another dungeon core of the same faction will be able to draw on the ambient mana in the defending territory to maintain their state of existence. If the defending dungeon core manages to push their entire territory over the neutral border, then they become the attacker. If they become the attacker, they lose the ability to receive aid through additional defenders, and the defenders sent from other cores inside the territory lose the benefit of relying on ambient mana to survive. And those defenders can also not participate in expanding the territory over the neutral border. In the event that an attacker expands enough to encompass the dungeon of the defending dungeon core, most of the functions of the dungeon as a whole will collapse, though the stability of the rooms and tunnels are maintained. Once this happens, it's easy enough for the attacking core to send in their own defenders to the warning to those around her to step back. She activated her new ability and focused on what she wanted it to look like. Instead of the stone barrier blocking off most of the room like it did to the hallway up above, Issa formed it in her mind a little differently, pushing more of her mana into it than the base amount of 50 earth mana it required. She thought that was okay, however, as she knew she could reabsorb it when she was done. The stone barrier above had been broken, unfortunately, and the mana used in its construction was lost. But this one wasn't likely to be damaged by the time she was done with it. In all, Issa pumped 200 earth mana into the ability and mentally formed a square column of stone that slowly emerged from the floor, raising her higher into the air until she was 10 feet above the crowd. And she was able to easily see them all, as well as them being able to see her. The throng quieted when they saw her emerge on top of a literal stone pedestal, though as travel-weary and experienced with the strange habits of Fred as they were, they barely blinked an eye at what she could do. Issa went a bit more in depth about her resurrection via a dungeon core piece, their journey to all roads, Fred's accidental destruction of another core, Ragnar's resurrection, and what it meant that she and the big man, as well as DC, were shards. She answered some more questions about all of that before she explained what had happened above with the monster army sent to ultimately kill Fred, the decision of the All Roads Council, and all of their relatively free status, though they were told to stay below, which was almost like still being imprisoned. She also described what the status of the surrounding land looked like, as much as she could piece together from Fred's descriptions, with his territory, the enemy monsters, and the contraction of Fred's border being the most important factors. It didn't take much explanation about the probable outcome of Fred's territory collapsing for them all to understand the threat that they, and the entire city of All Roads, were under. By the end of her rather depressing speech, the room was silent, as everyone absorbed what was told to them. Finally, Raspel surprised her by speaking first. "This sounds like a right mess, it does. I'm all for helping out wherever I'm needed, but what in the world can we do about it?" His question was followed up by everyone in the room, including all of the townspeople, chiming in and agreeing with him. Issa didn't have a ready answer for that, but fortunately for her, Ragnar did. "This doesn't sound much different from when your town of Gatecross was attacked, though I will admit that this is on a much bigger scale than that. What was it that you did back then when you found your lives on the line?" He asked those in front of him, his powerful voice projecting so that everyone in the room could hear him. "We trained and prepared for their coming. But how are we supposed to do that here?" Metch responded. "Well, where do you think you're standing right now? Sure, it's empty now, but I'm sure that it won't be for long. And I also have a feeling that Fred may be onto something that can help with all of this. Though I have no idea what that is. He'll let us know soon, I imagine. But for now, we can at least train to improve your skills." "That's all well and good, but without Fred, how are we supposed to train without monsters to fight?"
Come in.
Issa saw Ragnar smile, and she agreed. So, in the effort to finally clear his mind of those distractions, he looked around his immediate area, the walls of All Roads and his territory border one last time. Then he deliberately deactivated his territorial... reactivated his territorial sight. And then he freaked out when he couldn't feel his territory anymore. In less than a second of sheer panic, Fred reactivated his sight and sighed in relief as his territory seemed just fine. A quick look around showed everything just the way it should be. He had worried that he'd inadvertently collapsed his territory when he did that, which at that point would be extraordinarily bad. While he might be able to establish a territory again before the nearby cores recovered from its sudden disappearance and expanded their own territories, he didn't think his chances were that great that none of them took advantage in just that short amount of time. Fortunately, despite not being able to feel or sense it, his territory seemed to stay intact. He tried again a couple of times, extending the time his territorial sight was down all the way up to about 5 minutes, and was again relieved when there was no change. With a deep breath, Fred deactivated his sight again, knowing that it was going to be down for as long as he was working on the project that he needed full concentration for. After about 10 minutes of sitting there nervously and almost twitching with the need to turn it on again, he tried to calm himself, but it was difficult. With his territorial sight off for probably the first time since he'd absorbed Furbay and Frozzles back near his parents' dungeon, it felt like a piece of him was missing that he didn't realize was always there. In the beginning and in between his need to establish a territory, he had unconsciously used it to sense where nearby territories were, even without knowing he was doing it. And now it felt as though he was partially blind. Regardless of how strange and uncomfortable it felt, he had a job to do, and the absence of his sight was exactly what he needed. After another 10 minutes of paranoia setting in, he reactivated it again and saw that everything was still fine. So he immediately got rid of it again and settled down. He consoled his paranoia by telling himself that if he didn't do what he needed to accomplish, then it wouldn't matter if his territory collapsed, or something important happened that he wasn't immediately aware of. It also helped to knowing that all the humans didn't have the same skills he had, and they had survived thousands of years without territorial sight, so he could too. When he was finally ready, Fred mentally blocked out the noises that were coming from the other dungeon room, which was way easier than trying to block out the feeling of his ever-shrinking territory. He already saw that Issa and Regnark were doing something with the guild and the townspeople of Gatecross, which he was glad for. Fred felt a brief spike of regret from basically ignoring them for the most part since they were rescued from the prison above. But even that he pushed aside and cleared his mind. He looked inside himself, to the cores he had mentally constructed to contain both his unconverted and elemental mana. At least Fred thought that they were just mental representations. His original intention when he was making them had just been to better contain and manipulate the free-floating mana his body contained. And the cores were the most familiar and easiest to visualize. His mana before had been practically infused inside the smallest parts of his human body, separate and not as clearly accessible as they could be. When he looked around his body now, he could still see multiple faint lines running through his limbs and ending up back at his chest, where he had visualized his cores. It almost mirrored his veins, where the blood pumped by his heart traveled all throughout his body. But it was much more vibrant and colorful, with the rich blue of water, the burning red of fire, the healthy green of nature, the dark brown of earth, and the deep black of the dark element passing through every inch of his form. In short, it was a wonderful visualization of the mana he had inside his body, and also provided a glimpse of how it had kept him alive, even after being burnt to death, decapitated, and blown up by an exploding earth core. But what if it's not a visualization, but actual real constructs? He had never considered it before because it sounded ridiculous. Where would it even fit? How in the world would I have 6 cores inside my body without them killing my human body? When he looked at them with his mana sight, he pictured them essentially right smack in the middle of his torso, just above his stomach and slightly below his lungs. If they were really there, he was sure they would interfere with his organs somehow, wouldn't they? Without actually cutting himself open and visually looking, or having someone else do it, there was no real way to tell. And there was no way he wanted that to happen, even though he knew he would survive. He was done with dying, or even just nearly dying, for the month, thank you very much. Therefore, Fred did the only thing he could think of to test his theory, that the cores inside of him were actually real. He tried to make another one, using half of his water mana, because it was the calmest of his elements, so he thought it was the easiest to work with. He tried to visually create a core inside himself that was approximately half the size of his original one. Warning. You are attempting to place another water elemental core inside your vessel where one already exists. Doing so will replace it with your new one, which will permanently destroy the previous core. Do you wish to proceed? Yes? No? Fred immediately said no, as he didn't want to give it a chance to do it automatically if he didn't choose fast enough. He'd already experienced that before, and once was more than enough. He wasn't sure if it would cut his core in half, thereby reducing his current maximum amount of water mana, which would waste all those days of building it up to its current level. As soon as he said no, the water mana was reabsorbed into his elemental core, bringing it back to where it started from. Fire mana, 301 out of 301. Water mana, 300 out of 300. Nature mana, 300 out of 300. Earth mana, 300 out of 300. Dark mana, 300 out of 300. Unconverted mana, 68,460. 45. All of his elemental mana had been rapidly increasing since he hadn't been using any lately. So much so that they were all at a maximum of 300 or more. In addition, because there were so many humans inside of his dungeon, his unconverted mana total was rapidly increasing as well. He knew from experience that at some point the amount he was receiving from them would taper off and stop altogether, but they were still providing plenty for his use. Not only that, but he had noticed earlier that when Charisse the Inquisitor, as well as the brief visit by the All-Roads governmental guards alerting the woman to the army attacking outside, had provided nearly insane levels of for the short time they were there, which only served to show how important high-rated adventurers were to high-rated dungeon cores. Slightly frustrated by his failure with the water mana, Fred decided to try making additional elemental cores using the other elements, but ended up with the same result. He even tried to use his unconverted mana to create another human core, but he quickly selected no when it appeared as though it wanted to replace what he had there already. Then, because nothing seemed to be working, he tried combining 2 different elements together. Then 3, then all of them, and then just human and 1 other element or 2. But no combination he tried worked to do anything. The combinations actually seemed to want to do something, which he was happy to see, but it all gave him the same warning, and he was unwilling to risk upsetting the balance in his core by saying yes to anything. Having no luck and feeling a little down, because he really thought he had a good idea, Fred decided to turn his territorial sight back on, because he wasn't sure how long he'd been experimenting. Fortunately, everything still looked the same as it had earlier, though it appeared to be night outside, and the border was continuing to shrink at an alarming rate, especially around the light and air faction areas. Looking around, he saw that the gobs of free-floating earth, dark, and nature mana outside the walls of All-Roads were still there. But he didn't want to use those quite yet, until he had a clear idea of what they would be best used for. They were a mess to his mana sight and blocked a clear view of the immediate area around the walls, however. So Fred decided to clear his head a bit from the failed attempts at creating other cores inside of him, and took the time to clean up the mana outside. One by one, he grabbed all of the nature mana blobs and stuck them together. Then he did the earth mana orbs, followed by the dark mana, until he had 3 separate huge floating blobs of mana outside the walls, at least 25 feet high and almost that wide. Now, instead of thousands of tiny orbs blocking his view, he had 3 massive ones. Knowing that he had only exchanged one problem for a slightly better one, he wanted to move them somewhere out of the way and close by. But he didn't want Regnark or Issa to accidentally run into them. The influx of that amount of mana all at once, he thought might kill them. So he brought them underground, placing them inside the dirt and stone near his dungeon, but not actually inside, mainly so that it wouldn't be automatically absorbed. Unfortunately, as soon as he placed the earth mana inside the dirt, it started to break up into thousands of blobs again, dispersing through the ground all around the outside of the dungeon for some reason. The dark and nature seemed fine. It was just the earth reacting with the ground that was having an issue. So Fred simply gathered it all back up and set it high above the city of All-Roads where it would stay out of trouble, only to find it floating gently back to the ground, hitting stone streets of the city and breaking apart into thousands of tiny pieces again. It's almost like putting it all together made it heavier than it had been, and it breaks apart when it comes in contact with its natural element. Fred tried the same thing with the other blobs of mana, and found that they also sunk back to the ground, but didn't break apart, until the nature one touched a tree growing in the backyard of one of the residential quarters houses. It started to break apart similarly to the earth blob, though not nearly as dramatically. He almost left them all that way since they weren't blocking his vision anymore, but he also wanted them together, so that if he needed to use them in a hurry, he wouldn't have to individually find each and every one of them again. Thinking about what he did with the nature cores, which were brought to him back in Gatecross, he thought that he might be able to do the same thing he'd done with them. At that time, he was able to take the mana that had been absorbed from them, which he didn't really need, as he only wanted some more blueprints from them, and condense it down, inserting it back into their cores. This had the added benefit of increasing their core crystallization, which was key to increasing their core rating, and most seemed appreciative. It was a similar process which he'd used to create his own internal cores, but completely different at the same time. Of course, he didn't have another core he could shove it back into, but he wanted to see if it would work the same way. He'd rather have 10 to 20 smaller condensed orbs of mana than thousands of tiny ones floating around. Using the earth mana blob first, since it had been the most trouble, he broke off a good-sized chunk of it about the size of his torso, and concentrated on condensing it down until it got smaller and smaller. By some good fortune, it seemed to work. By the time it was about a quarter of the size of his fist, he let go of his concentration, expecting it to stay that way. And just like everything else he'd tried lately, it failed. The earth blob instantly sprang back to its original size, as his condensation of the mana lost cohesion. It was like he hadn't done anything to it, and there was nothing keeping it condensed together without his direct control. He thought about it for a moment before he condensed it again, and then pulled a small chunk, about 50 units of his unconverted mana from his human core. Wrapping the clearish non-element around the condensed form of earth mana, he created a thin shell around it, and imagined it hardening to create a smooth bubble of sorts to keep the earth mana contained. And then he let his concentration focused on condensing the brown mana go. It held, for all of 5 seconds. He could see the mana inside the small bubble expand and strain at the clear shell, until it finally gave way and it burst apart, all of the mana inside practically vaporizing and disappearing. The resulting explosion was also unexpected, and he was glad he had done his experiment underground where no one was around, though it did make the ground shake enough that he felt it even from where he was sitting. He looked at where it had been, and he saw a hole 4 times the size of the condensed orb blown into the underground portion of the stone and dirt he'd been using as a lab. I guess that didn't work. It almost looked like what happened when the small earth core had used its mana combustion skill and exploded, destroying Fred's body and actually killing Issa. He stared at the hole in the dirt using his territorial sight for what felt like forever, as thoughts about what he had just witnessed coursed through his mind. It felt like everything he knew about mana, cores, and core structures had just been turned on its head, and his brain was starting to hurt from the ramifications of what he had seen. If what he thought was true, then everything could change. And if he was indeed correct, he was more than sure he could create another core. But it was going to take a lot more mana. What he ultimately realized about the entire process stemmed from his, at the time unwanted, education on dungeon core reproduction. According to his parents, a new dungeon core was born between 2 cores as they mingled their mana together. The new core was born after days or even months of this mingling, though of course Fred could never figure out why it took that long. But he had an idea about it now. What they were actually doing, as far as he could understand, was working together to make something similar to what he was just trying to create with his condensed earth mana blob, though on a much, much smaller scale. Unbeknownst to them, he assumed, one core would mentally condense a very small amount of mana down until it was barely larger than a pebble, while the other would create a thin shield around it with their own mana. That shield would take a while to fully harden, or crystallize, into a shell that could contain the condensed mana. It took a while because, as Fred had just seen, elemental mana didn't want to stay in one state without some supreme effort on the side of the cores. Once it had crystallized enough and formed into the shape it needed to become a baby core, The condensed mana inside would stay in that state. Only after years of being condensed would it crystallize as well. And then, when any core gathered more mana, they would store it inside their crystallized form, where in turn it would slowly crystallize and add to the existing core, thereby increasing its rating, and everything that went with that. As he put that all together, Fred realized what made him special and different from a normal dungeon core: his unconverted mana. His human side could manipulate unconverted mana as well, or even better than any of the elemental mana he possessed, which was something that other cores probably only dreamed of. Or not, because very few seemed to want to have anything to do with mana that was associated with humans. Regardless of the truth of that statement, Fred was all too aware of what his possession of usable unconverted mana meant. Looking back at how he had condensed the mana borrowed from the nature cores with a new eye, he realized that he had inadvertently infused the nature mana he was condensing with a small amount of his human mana after it had been in his possession, which was how it was able to stabilize and crystallize it so quickly. It didn't require a shield or bubble around it like the formation of a new core, because he was already shoving it into an acceptable vessel already, the nature core. Now, knowing this, or at least thinking he understood what had happened, Fred checked his territory quickly and then shut off his territorial sight again, which got rid of the pushing and prodding it felt like his body was undergoing from the dungeon defenders outside attacking it. He didn't want any distractions now, because what he was doing could be dangerous. The explosive properties of his last experiment were evidence enough of that. The problem was that he wanted to see what he was doing with his own eyes using his mana sight. So he was going to do it right there in the dungeon. Here goes nothing. Chapter 13. Fred stood up, his body protesting a little from sitting down against the wall for an unknown amount of time. Stretching for a moment, he faced the center of the relatively small dungeon room and blocked out the sounds coming from the other space in his dungeon. He had glanced over there earlier with his territorial sight, seeing that Issa and Ragnark were creating and recreating various defenders, and the others were practicing different attacks and spells, though they looked a bit strange to Fred after a while. I'll have to check that out later. Fred, what exactly are you doing? I felt the explosion, or whatever it was, earlier and left you alone, because you seemed intent on what you were doing. But if you're going to try something like that in here, I'd probably advise against it. He jumped at DC's voice in his head, as he had forgotten she was there in the room with him. Fred hesitated before he responded, because he wasn't altogether sure that what he would... sure that what he was doing was safe, but he really thought he had it handled. I'm not going to be using nearly as much as I was before.
I had a saltwater aquarium for several years, and there's lots of encrusting corals like this, brain corals, and they'll encrust like a whole rock. They'll encrust over other corals, and they'll run up right next to another coral. And sometimes you have like a dead line where their stingers come out at night and fight each other. Sometimes they're okay and they'll just be right up against each other. So, but this is natural, like them being right up against each other and different collars right up against each other. And you'll have your hard stony corals growing on top of encrusting corals like that. That's kind of like a bird nest or a Christmas tree. I think that's that. I already poured it out, I just didn't use it.
qualities, he observed, to anyone with his instructor class. While they were shocked that he could do that in the first place, like everyone else who knew that secret about him, they were disappointed when he described that the likelihood of success for higher-rated spells and abilities, especially ones higher rated than his own rating, was nearly 0%. Still, he could see some intrigued faces among the council. But that wasn't necessarily what they were most interested in, as he soon found out. Do you have any more pieces of dungeon cores that you can use to make more of these shards, as you call them? The Elder asked. Fred wasn't sure if she was asking because she wanted him to make more, or was worried that he would. He cautiously responded, I don't have any more pieces of the cores I accidentally destroyed. It was only luck that the few pieces that I did find were still intact and usable. In order to make more, I'd have to destroy another core, which is the furthest thing from my mind at the moment. The Elder waved away his response. Yes, I understand that. And I'm not asking you to go out and destroy any more dungeons. The City of All Roads is already in enough trouble as it is. We don't need to invite more problems. But what I really want to know is this. You said that you're a dungeon core as well, right? Yes, at least partially, Fred answered, unsure of what she was getting at. Well then, what's to stop you from breaking off a piece of your own cores to use during this shard-making process? The Elder asked, which froze the room into silence. Fred wasn't frozen, however. Well, first of all, my cores don't actually have a physical presence, he said before he cut himself off this time. That's actually not entirely true if I look at it a certain way. Something extremely important tugged his attention away from the All Roads Council session, where he was the main attraction. As he looked at his territory's borders, his heart felt like it dropped into his stomach. I apologize for my inattention, Council, but there's something you should probably be aware of. Part 2. Territorial Warfare. Chapter 8. The Supreme of Air looked around her sprawling dungeon in anxiousness, though her mental state had nothing to do with what was going on inside. In fact, if she remembered correctly, there hadn't been a human inside her underground tunnels, deadly trapped rooms, and defender-filled spaces in nearly a decade. Has it really been that long? Thinking about that last visit, she remembered that it had only been brief, with the human group only spending about half a day inside her massive dungeon complex before they left, having lost one of their party along the way. Normally, invaders could spend weeks inside without even making it all the way through, and it had been disappointing that they hadn't all survived long enough to feed her a steady stream of mana from their presence. Regardless, she remembered enjoying the boost to her mana from that death, knowing that more would be coming soon. Except that they hadn't. The small human town at the bottom of the mountain her dungeon catacombed had been steadily shrinking in the quantity of livestock living there over the years, until about 6 months ago it finally appeared to be completely abandoned. Air had expanded her territory so that it encompassed the now deserted habitation, adding much-needed ambient mana to the upkeep of her dungeon. Her core was in a prime position, fortunately, so she received quite a bit of ambient mana from her territory. Normally, it was enough to maintain her dungeon with a little bit left over for growth, so anything that added to that was welcome. Therefore, she hadn't been too worried about the loss of the nearby town. She knew from listening to their conversations that the humans considered her dungeon to be famous, and they would travel for weeks or even months just to visit it. Her S-10th rated dungeon had the best loot, excellent challenges, and a reputation for being less deadly to the invaders who were of the cautious variety. Air prided herself on making sure that her defenses and defenders were all able to be defeated by a determined group of livestock, and was even known to reduce the challenge, just a little, inside her dungeon when it was obvious they weren't quite up to it. Keeping them inside her dungeon for longer periods of time was almost as good as their deaths, so her usual intent was not to outright kill them. That's not to say she gave them a free pass. Reducing the challenge really meant that she took out a defense or defender or two, just to put them on more of an even playing field. She wanted them to have to work for their rewards, which also ensured that they stayed longer to rest and recover, thereby increasing the amount of mana she received from their presence. It was a basic dungeon operation method that had been tried and true for thousands of years. Again, she hadn't been worried at first. There were times in the past when years flew by between visitations, though it hadn't been nearly as long as it was currently. It was only when she had become impatient about a month ago that she deliberately searched around her territory, and the territories of her nearby neighbors, to look for the next group of humans searching for her dungeon. And she found nothing. Well, not nothing. With her superior territorial sight and given access as her status as the Supreme of Air, she was able to essentially connect and see through any core's territory in her faction, though she couldn't directly influence anything. Regardless of that limitation, Air saw that even within a week's traveling distance, in human terms, there were groups of humans invading other dungeons. The only thing was, however, that all of them appeared to be so weak that they wouldn't survive past the first few rooms in her 463-room dungeon, unless of course she severely handicapped it for them, which was something she would consider if it came down to that, but she doubted she would even have the chance. Her own dungeon was barely even spoken about, and when she actually recognized her location during a conversation she was overhearing, she realized that she wasn't likely to see anyone anytime soon. Not going there. That mountain dungeon is S-rated, and the DAS has labeled it off-limits until it can be re-evaluated. Let's just stick to these ones here, because I, for one, do not want to die. They say that place is cursed anyway, because any party that's gone in there has lost at least one person, and the risk isn't worth it. That disturbed her more than a little bit, but Air knew deep down that all she had to do was wait for the humans in the area to become a bit more powerful before they decided to invade her dungeon again. Except, when she looked around more comprehensively, even ranging farther than could be reasonably expected for the humans to travel to her location, she saw the same disturbing trend. Their livestock was slowly dying out. It was extremely gradual, however, and it wasn't immediately obvious. It was only because she'd been around a lot longer than almost any other dungeon core, at least in her portion of the world, that she was able to see the changes, comparing her memories of the early days when her kind was hunted down by the humans, who seemed to be everywhere, and in such concentrations that it was hard to find a place to put down a territory, and what it looked like today, she saw a vast difference. While there were still quite a few humans in concentrated areas, cities and kingdoms she remembered hearing them called, they were few and far between. Air was pretty sure she knew the reason for that. The war between the factions had a big role in that reduction of human